And which Buddhist tradition?
No.
Not a particular Buddhist tradition?
We ethnically...
It's a cultural tradition? Chinese, okay.
So Confucian is
right.
the mainstream there.
Okay.
But that's not religious.
Right, more cultural. Right. Which is similar in some ways to Catholics. I think there is a Catholic cultural tradition and a Catholic religious tradition, and they overlap. But some people come from Catholic parts of the world, and it's very much a part of the culture, not just religious life.
Jewish.
And Jewish. That's what I was going to say next. Yeah. So, and then as Americans or those of European descent, there is an overall kind of a Christian culture too. We don't think about it because we swim in it, all the time. But it is a huge cultural influence as well as a religious influence. But of course, all of the world's major traditions are similar to Christianity in that within the larger religious framework, you find a range of diverse kinds of practices and approaches to that same religion. Welcome, whoever is signing in. Hi. I'm going to do a little bit of a personal introduction. We've already introduced ourselves, so when you get settled into your seat, if you want to just tell us your name and if you are involved or affiliated with a particular religious tradition.
Carol Bennett, belong to First Baptist Church in Fort Walton. Okay, great.
So we have a nice mix of the range of the Christian denominations. Well, I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about myself personally, and then we'll spend, the majority of the time telling you about Unitarian Universalism and where it came from, what we're about. I have a handout that I'm going to give you in a little bit that will kind of help me walk through some points. And but I wanted to start out by just telling you a little bit about my own journey. I was raised in a family where my mother grew up going to a Christian church that was kind of in the country, and my father's background was Episcopalian. When I was growing up, we moved around a lot, so we weren't involved in one particular church, and I ended up getting very involved with the Presbyterian church at a younger age. And are you Presbyterian? Yeah. I discovered the Presbyterians because the Girl Scouts met there first. And then some of my friends who were in the Girl Scouts were in the choir in the church. And so I joined the youth choir and then the youth group. And I became a deacon at a young age. And it was actually in my Presbyterian confirmation class that we held in the library of the church that I started having an interest in other world religious traditions as well. Now, many people who come to Unitarian Universalism and some of the more liberal or open-minded versions of Christianity that you can find today do that because they have difficult experiences in the church of their childhoods, either with a dogma or a doctrine that they felt was imposed upon them, or they had a conflict between the doctrine and dogma and how people actually behaved. By saying one thing and then treating people another way. And at some point, they became uncomfortable. So in Unitarian Universalism, we have a lot of people who have come from other traditions, and a certain number of them have come because they had a difficult experience there, and they're looking for something that gives them a little bit more space to be themselves. My particular experience in the Presbyterian church as I was growing up, I attended the same church in Indianapolis from the time I was 9 in the 4th grade through high school. And I got, as I mentioned, kind of progressively more involved. And in my confirmation class, as I was saying, when I was 11, I did not feel, I felt like my questions were welcomed. And I did not feel any doctrines or were imposed on me at all. But as we went through and were studying the scripture in particular, it was at that age, even at 11, that I felt that there was a certain amount of the scripture that I could accept metaphorically but not literally. And specifically, when Jesus is attributed to have said, "I am the only way," I felt like I can accept that metaphorically because I love the life and teachings of Jesus. But even as an 11-year-old, living in the United States, knowing that the world is a big place and there are cultures all around the world, to me, it just didn't make sense that if you had never heard about Jesus, you were out. I did not think that that's what he meant when we attributed those words to him. So in the library there, I saw on the bookshelf a standard book called, at that time it was called The Religions of Man by Houston Smith, and it's now called The World's Religions, letting go of the sexist language that was, very, very prevalent at that time. And so I ended up reading the whole book about the religions of man, and that's when, sometimes I say that's when I became a Unitarian Universalist without knowing it. That's when I started appreciating the world's religious traditions and trying to see the wisdom that's available in all of them, and to recognize that if someone grows up in another culture, in another place around the world, they may have a religious tradition that is very different from what I experience, but it could work for them. And my conception of God is that if God is an infinite presence in the universe, how would something infinite decide to express itself in just one single form that would not be accessible to all of humanity? So that's where I started kind of expanding my interest beyond Christianity, while still appreciating Christianity as my first religious tradition. Because I had a very positive experience in the Presbyterian Church through the music and the liturgy. I was very involved with the youth program. I had a youth minister who was an incredibly positive influence on me. I had a couple of really great opportunities as a young person to do some traveling. I traveled with the Disciples of Christ denomination to Jamaica on a cultural exchange. And then the following summer, I went with the American Friends Service Committee on a youth project to California, and I was there for 6 weeks. So when I had not heard of the Quakers or the Society of Friends, but through the experience of going on the work project, I learned about the Quakers. And for me, of all the Christian traditions, that resonated with me because, the Quakers talk about the divine light in every person. And so that was an approach that really worked for me. It wasn't until my daughter was 9 and I was starting to look for a church to take her that I found Unitarian Universalism. And I was attracted because of the liberal, progressive kind of open language. And once I went there, I felt even more of a resonance than I did with the Quakers. Going to a Quaker college, I don't know if I mentioned that, I ended up going to a Quaker college, which was also a great fit for me because I was having a growing interest in social justice work. And for me, the Quakers, the Friends, really put their faith into practice in doing social justice work. So when I was in California, the youth project I was on, we were renovating what had been previously army barracks into permanent housing for a farm worker housing cooperative, family farm worker housing cooperative. And it had also been, the army base had also been a Japanese detention center, which was very interesting. But while we were there, in addition to helping kind of remodel these barracks into permanent housing, we learned a lot about agribusiness and, the Farm Workers Union, and just it was very educational, but also an education in a way that equipped us as young people to make life choices based on ethical ideals. And so when I was introduced to Unitarian Universalism, one of the things that I really liked about that is it had the same social justice emphasis, but as many of you know, the Quakers enjoy silent worship. Not all, there's differences even in the Quaker and Friends tradition. Some have churches and some have ministers, but a lot of the Quakers don't have ministers. And sorry, that's okay. While the silent worship I enjoyed to a certain extent, what my experience of silent Quaker worship was that it builds a very deep relationship in a small community of people. And it is a kind of spiritual support system to help people be social activists in their day-to-day life. But there's an intimacy there that can be hard to break into sometimes. And so when I went to a Unitarian Universalist church for the first time, what I really liked about it is it had a very similar philosophy to the Quakers, but with the more Protestant tradition that I had been familiar with from when I was a Presbyterian. The music, the liturgy, the spoken word, and the activism was there. But what was different about Unitarian Universalism that really appealed to me when I went for the first time was this openness to the wisdom of the other world's religious traditions, and its openness to non-religious approaches to living an ethical life. So not everyone who came to a Unitarian Universalist church affiliated themselves or self-identified with a specific religious tradition. It was a place that was inclusive to those who did not consider themselves religious and who would often self-identify if asked as either an agnostic, someone who doesn't know, or an atheist for whom God language is not helpful. And what makes Unitarian Universalism, I think, unique among the Christian denominations that are out there today is that we are a safe and welcoming place for people who are comfortable identifying as either atheist or agnostic. And even in those are a couple of terms that are used, and then another couple of terms that can be in the mix would be a humanist, which is basically you can have a religious humanist or a secular humanist. And I consider myself a religious humanist, and I'll explain that a little bit. Humanism basically says that human beings have created a social order, and we're responsible for doing the best that we can with it. So we're not necessarily, as human beings, we may get support from something outside of us individually, but we need human answers to human problems. So we need to take responsibility for how well our society runs. And if there are people who are treated unfairly, we need to attend to that. And that it gives up the idea that there's some force beyond humanity that is going to save us from ourselves. If there is a force that can save us, it's still up to us to do it. That's what humanism is. And so that means that you can be a religious humanist, which means that you believe that human beings are responsible for constructions of reality or society, and for whom religious language is helpful in leading a full and ethical life, or you can be what's called a secular humanist, which goes back to what I was saying about people who self-identify as atheists. They're basically saying, God language doesn't work for me. That doesn't make sense to me or my experience of the world. It doesn't mean they can't be ethical people. And it also doesn't mean that they don't have experiences of awe and wonder and reverence. It usually doesn't, it's not attributed to God. It's often attributed to the universe and the amazing system of nature that's at work that we experience as human beings. For many atheists, God language, kind of like the experience that I had as a younger person, can be too limiting to particular traditions or to particular concepts for that to work for them. So that's one of the things that drew me to Unitarian Universalism. The inclusion of really diverse paths of exploring and being human while still being accountable to some ethical standards. And this openness to continue learning and growing. Now, I'm going to give kind of a little bit of background about Unitarian and Universalism in the United States. And I'm going to move kind of quickly, because what I really want to do is I have a handout that can tell you in a little bit more detail what we're about. But and if you have questions, I do want to leave time for questions. So if you have a question that you feel is relevant to exactly where we are, just raise your hand and I'll stop. Yes?
You mentioned about the migrant workers and Juarez.
That was in California? Mm-hmm.
In California?
Yes.
And that you was exposed to the migrant workers?
Yes.
And you mentioned that something about was very educational to you. I want to know what exactly did you see that caused you to feel very interested, or what was it so impressive to you?
What I would say about that is one of the things that I really appreciated about the American Friends Service Committee, it was a Quaker, a religious group that I went with to California, and this applies also to Unitarian Universalism, that the social justice efforts that we do are not considered missionary work. We're not out to convert people. We're out to help people, and under the broadest term, it would be called community development. But what makes it different from missionary work, besides missionary work by definition means that you're out to help people, but you're also out to convert people to your religious tradition, if they're open to it. And Quakers and Unitarian Universalists are not proselytizing like that. Basically, we support people's religious traditions that are working for them, and if it's not working for you, we encourage you to enter a path where you can find a religious tradition that works for you. But another real difference is that the social justice work that we do is based on the practice of self-determination, that each person in each community needs to be empowered to make its own decisions about what is appropriate for them. And so what was really energizing about that project is that this was a farm worker housing cooperative where families had joined together to create their own housing cooperative. And it was raising their quality of life, and it was increasing the economic security of this community, and it was run by farm worker families. You know, it wasn't run by well-meaning white people.
Well, I still don't understand.
Uh-huh.
You're saying, like, for example, that this a group of migrant workers were like living like in a commune setting? Is that
No.
like, these people did not live there, they were just there for working, right?
No. We were there while the barracks were being renovated, but the housing cooperative made it so that people could afford decent housing. The families that were going to live there, they had already set aside money to live there. So it was kind of like a, I don't know how to explain it, but you pay to be a part of the community, and then once you purchase your home, you're living in a community.
In a migrant worker community?
Yes.
I see. And so these people only work in the fields?
That's right.
And why are they called migrant workers if they live there?
Well, that's a good question. But the process had not been finished yet. But what it was doing was helping migrant workers to get a better quality of housing and more stability for their families. I mean, they could still continue to work, and at some point, if they could get more economic stability, they could move into another area, and they could get education and get different kinds of jobs, and it provided that stability to their families.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, the reason I'm asking
Yes.
you all this is
Yeah.
I happen to be a founder of the Migrant Council in the state of Illinois.
Oh.
It's nationwide.
Oh, great.
And that's why I was asking
Right.
you, because
Right.
generally these people are called migrant workers
Right.
because they move from state
Right.
to state, but they generally live in
Right.
sometimes better quarters than we have in their own home,
Uh-huh.
say Texas or Arizona or Illinois.
Right, right.
They just like to work in the field.
Right.
And they
Right. Well, this has been also some time ago, so I'm sure that it's changed since when I was there. I was in high school at that time.
Yeah, well, I founded migrant workers in 1961.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay.
Great. Well, maybe we could talk more about that afterwards.
Well, I was just interested because through my experience, people
Right.
have the wrong impression of migrant
Right,
workers.
right.
That they are living in nothing, and that's
Right.
the way they choose to be
Right.
while they're working.
Yes, some of them,
But
yes.
It's not their life.
Right.
And so I just want to make that clear.
I
These
got-
people are educated
Right.
in school and everything else, just like everybody else.
Right. Good. I'm glad that you brought that up.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Unitarian Universalism's history in the United States. And we were a part of the Protestant Reformation. So we come from the Protestant tradition. And within that, we're associated with what's called the Radical Reformation, or the groups that were the most kind of democratic in social organization, where there were, sometimes there were not ministers, like the Quaker tradition doesn't always have a minister, because the idea of the Protestant Reformation is that there's no authority that has to channel your access to the divine. And this was with the access to the Bible and translations and the access to the communion ritual, that it's not just a select group of people. See, what happened with the Protestant Reformation is that there's no intermediary between you and your experience of the divine. So in some of the Protestant groups, there were no clergy, and it was the group that led itself. They may be certain identified leaders, or if they did have clergy, the clergy were accountable to the whole group. And so that's what we know about the Protestant tradition. That's something different from the Catholic tradition and the Anglican tradition out of the Church of England. What is uniquely different, and I've mentioned this a couple of times already, but I'll just lift it up once again, with Unitarian Universalism and how we changed as we've been in the United States setting, is that we have expanded beyond the traditional Christianity and its exclusiveness to only the Christian tradition. So while we have, what we say is we have Christian and Jewish roots, of course, because Christianity came from Judaism, But Unitarian Universalism as a Protestant tradition has moved beyond just Christianity, and so technically we're not a Christian denomination because we do not require the belief in Jesus as the one and only Savior. Similar to Quakers, but a little bit different from Quakers in that we do embrace the wisdom from the other world's religious traditions. So the Radical Reformation started what was called the Free Church tradition in the United States, and it's also there that out of that the Puritans and the Pilgrims, and then the Congregationalists emerged out of that. Unitarians also come from the Congregationalist tradition, and so the Disciples of Christ that I mentioned before, they are congregational cousins of the Unitarian Universalists. Again, it's the democratic process at work. And many of the founding fathers and mothers of the United States had Unitarian backgrounds. They were known to be kind of an educated elite that approached the scripture very intellectually and approached social reform very intellectually, but really did a lot of things like the founding of the Red Cross and schools and asylums for the mentally ill, and those kinds of things, social benefit institutions that a lot of us take for granted in the United States. Many of them are attributed to Unitarians and scientists and all kinds of reformers. But the other thing that I just want to mention about the Free Church tradition and what's unique about religion in the United States and what happened here that was different from a lot of other places is that our founding fathers were very intentional about the separation of church and state. And because of that, there is more religious diversity in the United States than anywhere in the world. I mean, there's a lot of religious diversity in a lot of other countries. I'm not saying that there isn't. But because of our founding fathers and our core documents, we decided from the get-go that the democratic ideal of everyone being able to participate from whatever their background was not going to give an advantage to anyone's religious affiliation. And, that's something that comes into question now and then. But it really is a pretty remarkable new form of government that the world hadn't seen before. And it's something that, we often take for granted. Let's see if I've covered everything there. So there's cornerstones of freedom of religious practice and right of conscience that we find in the Protestant tradition and the American tradition are the roots of Unitarianism and Universalism in the United States. Now, Unitarians came, as I said, from kind of an educational elite background, whereas the Universalists were more what you would call blue-collar circuit riders. And what's interesting about the Universalists is they also came over from Europe to escape religious persecution. But their message was a really interesting one during those first couple of hundred years while the colonies were forming. At that time, the Puritans and the Pilgrims had this, it's a little bit of a caricature, but you probably will remember hearing sinners in the hand of an angry God. Jonathan Edwards, this idea that God the Father is a punishing Father, and you've got to do right or you're going to be punished and sent to hell and damnation and all of that. Well, the Universalists were a minority tradition that said, no, if there is a God, it has to be a loving God who would never turn his or her back on any of their children. So the Universalists do not believe in eternal damnation, and they believe in a loving God. And that was an alternative message during that time, and they were circuit riders. Well, what gradually happened among the mainstream, what we consider mainstream Christian denominations now, of which most of you are affiliated with, is the culture, the religious culture shifted away from that punishing language and embrace this idea of a loving God to varying degrees. And I mean, you hear the phrase, God is love quite often. That's something that we're familiar with. And as that cultural shift happened, universalism dwindled as a faith of its own. It kind of held on for a while, but really that was absorbed by the other denominations, and there was, at one time it grew very large because people were getting tired of that punishment language, but then once the other traditions shifted, then their numbers went down. So the Unitarians and the Universalists were in conversation for a long time, about 100 years actually, before they officially merged in 1961. So we just celebrated a couple of years ago our 50th anniversary as a denomination, although technically we're not a denomination either. We call ourselves a free association of congregations. A denomination technically means that you've got an authority organizational chart where you have a headquarters, and the people at the headquarters have a certain amount of authority to tell you what to do down here. Now, we're not the only tradition that is structured more democratically, but we do call ourselves a free association of congregations. So I'm going to hand out these pages, and if you take one and pass it along, we'll get into some more specifics about what we believe, what we do believe, or what we hold in common. We are called a covenanted religion as opposed to a creedal religion or religious movement, really. Unitarian Universalism is not a religion unto itself. We come from the Christian tradition, but we are influenced by other traditions, so we actually refer to ourselves more as a movement. Yes?
The one in Dalkey that call themselves Fellowship.
Right, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I wanted to just write a couple of things up here. Creed and covenant. Many religious traditions, especially from the Christian tradition, identify themselves according to a common creed that everybody says. You usually say it every Sunday. In a lot of the denominations that you represent here, say the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed, you're going to have a certain number of people in the congregations where you regularly attend who will say these creeds because it's a part of the religious tradition, but there might be some things in there that people are not sure that they believe totally, or they might have some questions about. But basically, you can still be identified with your faith community and say a creed, but you can still have some questions about the creed. Well, we're not a creedal tradition. We're called a covenanted tradition, which means that we don't have a common doctrine that we ask everyone to adhere to. What we have is called a covenant, and the original kind of covenant that influenced the founders of democracy, it goes back to what was called the Mayflower Compact and this whole idea of congregationalism, so that we have some ideas about God, but we also realize that we live in a world where we're always learning new things. So this idea that revelation is not sealed, not in Scripture or not in any one doctrine, because we're always learning more things. So the idea of the covenant is that we promise to walk with each other and be open to learning more of God's revelation for the earth and for humanity, knowing that we'll always know more together than we will separately. And that it's more important how we are and how we treat each other and be in relationship to each other and to our experience of the divine than to be unified by a common creed that may change as we change and we grow. I mentioned before the Unitarians came out of the Congregationalist tradition. The actual name Unitarian was given to a certain group of Congregationalist ministers who again were very intellectual elites. And basically what they were saying is they were looking at the Bible and saying, we have to use our human capacity for a reason to interpret the meaning of this text for us. So there's always interpretation when it comes to any sacred scripture. They were talking about the Bible. And when this particular group were looking at the Bible, what they saw from their background in biblical criticism is that there's a doctrine of the Trinity that the church came up with, but if you read the Bible, you won't find the doctrine of the Trinity there. And it wasn't so much a point about the Trinity, it's about how human beings should interact with the Bible and where that information comes from and how it can be the most meaningful to us today. Although, and that's where the name the Unitarians came out of, because we were questioning the doctrine of the Trinity being biblically based. Yes?
So you believe in the Bible or you don't?
We honor the sacred texts of the Bible, but not as a sealed revelation. We say that there's not a sealed revelation in any sacred text. We believe that there's meaning in all of the sacred texts of the world, but that they're culturally and historically influenced, and that if we're to determine wisdom for us, we need to look at those historical and cultural settings before it will be relevant to us.
But then you said atheists can come to you?
Yep. Yeah.
The atheists I know don't believe in God at all.
That's right.
So then they don't believe in the Bible because they don't believe in God.
Well, they can believe in the Bible. I mean, the Bible, you don't have to believe in it. It exists. What atheists don't believe in is God in any form.
In other words, they can read the Bible and a historical document.
Yeah, I mean, it's still and as a European or a European American, Euro American, the Bible is a huge cultural influence. So whether you believe it or not doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a certain amount of understanding of it. And I mean, it's rich with important stories to hear, and atheists would not disagree with that. They just wouldn't make the same interpretations, and that's why I was saying the Unitarians were talking about applying reason to religious texts to make sense of them.
When I was a high school teacher, in the gifted class, part of the curriculum was to teach the Bible as literature.
Right.
And on the SAT test, there will often be Bible-related questions.
That's true.
Not necessarily that you believe it is the Word of God.
It's an important...
Of course, I am a Christian.
Right.
But
it's an important part of our cultural tradition, no matter what we believe about it. And Christians don't have the same beliefs about the Bible. Whether you believe in God or not there's diversity there, and there's an interpretation process there. So, and then, so I talked about Unitarianism, and then the Universalist name is going back to the idea of a God would never turn his back on any of his children. And so this is how both of these traditions kind of, in their own ways, had a core belief that allowed them to expand beyond Christianity. Universalism said that there's no God that would ever turn his back or her back on any of his children. So that opened it up to other traditions, religious traditions, and it opened it up for atheists and agnostics. That it's every person's right and individual relationship to that which is divine to them that can be effective. And then the Unitarians, the idea of reason being applied to the scripture, but the other part of the Unitarian name that can be traced as a tradition backwards through history from when that term actually arose in American context, because we have Unitarian roots, Joel was mentioning, in Europe before this happened. When the early Christians were forming after Jesus' death, and the Nicene Creed was being formed, there were a lot of questions about the nature of Jesus. And at the Nicene Creed, there was a lot of debate. I mean, hours and hours of debate. Everybody was not of like mind, but we got all on the same page at the Creed. But there was a certain amount of people who basically said, we're asking the questions: Is Jesus divine? And if Jesus is divine, is Jesus co-equal with God? And what that means with the doctrine of the Trinity in particular, it means, does the person who we historically that we know as Jesus, was Jesus part of God from the very beginning along with the Holy Spirit? And some of the early Christians said, that doesn't make sense to us. We know that Jesus was in the line of the Hebrew prophets. And some of us really do believe he was the Savior, that he was God. But how could he have been part of God from the very beginning? Does that mean everything's predestined? Everything's already been worked out? Well, once you think that everything's worked out, there's a lot of things that are happening in our world that are hard to explain if it's already been worked out. Including, for a big example would be Nazi Germany. And a lot of Christians around the world, but in the United States in particular, were saying how, if we come from the same tradition, how could have something of this magnitude have occurred? And that's when actually a lot of Christians who were thinking about all of these things started changing their self-identification into more atheists and agnostics. I'm not so sure. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that there's not a bigger picture, but what we know about a religion is not working because it didn't prevent something as horrific as this. I don't know if that makes sense or not. So in Unitarian Universalism, people have different ideas about Jesus. And what we do as a denomination or as a tradition is we say, we honor and follow the life and teachings of Jesus. That is the core wealth of wisdom and ethical imperatives. We find it in the life and the teachings of Jesus. Where we part ways is with all of the doctrine that have been created by the church and various portions of the church about Jesus. So that opens it up. It changes it quite a bit. But basically what it is saying is, and again, back to the fact that we're not technically a Christian denomination because we don't believe in the exclusive salvation that only Jesus can provide. We look to him as a model and as an example, but we do not feel that if you're not saved by Jesus, you're going to hell or you're a bad person. We don't believe that.
You say, how could something like Nazi Germany happen? But, at some point or another, you have to, if you're going to believe in him, he talks about Satan and allowing Satan to rule and do too. So
okay.
It
well, and
doesn't
see,
necessarily mean that God was not at work in that, but the Satan could have been at work.
Right.
But God eventually is going to
right.
come back.
Okay. And then what I can say about that, just really simply, because these are meaty, these are really important questions. But what I said before about the basic humanism that, whether it's religious or secular humanism, that a lot of Unitarian Universalists share, is that to simplify what you're saying is, so did Nazi Germany happen because Satan caused people to do it? What we're saying is humanity is we're responsible for our own behavior. And if there is a Satan or a God out there, we need to figure that out. But we can't attribute bad things to either God or Satan. We have to take responsibility. And that's why one of kind of our little core sound bites is deeds, not creeds. Because you can believe a lot of different things, but really it's how you live and how you treat other people. I mean, that's why Jesus is an exemplar. Nobody is going to say, we don't think that Jesus is an exemplar, both in the way he lived his life and in his teachings. Not the church's teachings about him, or what he should mean to everyone. But what he stood for is unquestionably good for an ethical life. But you can follow the life and teachings of Jesus and not call yourself a Christian. And many Unitarian Universalists are like that. So I want to turn to this. How are we doing on time? Doing pretty good? Okay, because I do want to leave some space and time for more questions, and I appreciate the questions that have come up. But I thought we could just walk through this. I'll tell you a little bit about what this document is. We refer to this as our principles and purposes. As I said before, we're a covenanted faith, and we do, different congregations generally have a little covenant that we say on Sundays. Sometimes we say it some congregations say it every Sunday and some don't. But, and many of them are quite similar. So the one that we say in my congregation, and is it Lori or Laura? Okay, we'll compare and see. Ours is love is the spirit. Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Is that pretty similar?
On the back of their brochure is all the belief system.
Right. Well, what is on the back of her order of service is what I've given you here. This is what we call our purposes and principles. Let me see if you've got a covenant in here. It doesn't look like you have a covenant that you read every week. And some congregations don't. And I'll tell you why. And why we call this what we call it, the purposes and principles. We're very committed in our tradition to the idea of covenant rather than creed. And anything that starts to sound like a creed, there are certain people who will go, no. You know, that's too much like a creed. And so that's why some congregations don't have a covenant that they read every week, and some do, and why this is called our purposes and principles. Now, this is a document that was crafted, actually, it was a project that the Women's Federation within Unitarian Universalists ignited. And it was a democratic process, so it started kind of all out in the different congregations, and then we worked on it at our annual meetings. So it came about in 1983, so it's still, relatively new. And since that time, there was only one change made to it, and I'll tell you what it is when we get to it, but it was added the very next year. And we did reevaluate it. We went through a whole system-wide reevaluating process. And what they decided is that was a worthwhile process, but we didn't want to change anything yet. I mean, we felt, basically still good with this as a current kind of statement of common values is really the way that you can look at it. So it starts with a kind of a prelude and then not a postlude, but a summary statement. But it says right at the beginning, we're member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association. We're freely associated, and we covenant with each other to affirm and promote these principles and purposes and sources. So we have what we call the 7 principles, starting with the inherent worth and dignity of all person, and then justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance and encouragement of each other to spiritual growth, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience, both with religious affairs and other affairs in the society at large, and the democratic process that honors each person's right of conscience, a goal of peace and freedom for all peoples around the world, and respect and care for the interdependent web of life of which we're a part. Then we refer to it as a living tradition that is informed by multiple sources. So the next section is about the sources that we draw from. One is direct human experience. That's, empirical human experience of the transcending mystery of life and all of those forces that uphold life. The words and deeds of prophetic men and women throughout time that have confronted injustice and supported ethical action with a transforming power of love. The wisdom of the world's religious traditions, I've mentioned that before. The Jewish and Christian teachings that teach more than anything else love and care for the neighbor and for for the strangers in our midst. Basic compassion. Humanist teachings that I mentioned before, that human accountability and responsibility for everything that is a human construction. And the only thing that we changed was we added the earth-centered traditions, because that has been in recent years an area that a lot of people have kind of reconnected or reaffirmed humanity's relationship with the earth itself and with all of the spiritual traditions that honor the earth. So that can include indigenous traditions, or what are sometimes called pagan traditions, or Wiccan, or goddess-oriented, Celtic, Native American traditions, all of the earth-centered traditions that talk about the rhythm of the seasons and of humans being a part of that natural balance, and that we need to live in harmony with that natural balance and live taking responsibility for our impact on it. And then the closing part talks about what we call our religious pluralism. And Rod Debs is Rod Debs is the pastor at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Niceville, Valparaiso. And he is always lifting up that we're grateful for our religious pluralism, because even in our own congregations, we've got people who are really influenced by different things. So we have sub-communities, people who are interested in Buddhism or earth traditions. But what we say is that we are enriched by that diversity. That diversity does not divide us from each other, because we can still be a loving community. You do not have to think alike to love alike, is one of the kind of classic phrases from the Unitarian tradition. So we're appreciative of our pluralism. We feel like it makes us stronger and richer, and that as free congregations and members within congregations, we enter freely into a covenant of mutual trust and support. Any questions or comments?
Yes.
Yeah.
Regarding the Bible.
Do we get into the Bible?
Do you have a Unitarian Bible?
We do.
Do you have your own Bible?
We don't have our own Bible. There's a lot of there are a lot of versions of the Bible that are available. We don't have a Bible apart from the other versions that are there. Now, sometimes Thomas Jefferson is attributed to having Unitarian ideas, and he made it a Bible of the words of Jesus. I mean, he took out a lot of other stuff and made it all about just what Jesus's teachings were about. But we don't raise that above any other version of the Bible. Yeah. But we do draw from the Bible as one of sacred texts. Yeah.
Well, I think the covenant part you're talking about, they have affirmations at the end of the hymnal that they repeat. They hold hands.
Right.
The Unity Church, I think some other, or I think in the Catholic Church, it's Nicene Creed, that they hold hands.
Yeah, and again, that is that varies from congregation to congregation. The only other thing that we kind of hold in common is we have a logo or a symbol, and I was going to share that with you, and it's called a Flaming Chalice, and you often see it with two circles around it like this, which represents the two traditions, Unitarian and Universalism, coming together. Sometimes the chalice is offset because it has a history related to the Universalist logo, had the cross offset. And this was a way of the Universalists making an open space for broadening the experience around God. But so we adapted that and went with the Flaming Chalice. Now the symbol was actually originally used during World War II as a symbol on documents to help Jews and other people who were being persecuted in Germany to escape. There was like an underground railroad that Unitarians were a part of to try to help people get out, and they used the symbol on the papers so that people could travel, and then we adopted it later on as kind of a somewhat official symbol for us. But the other parts of it and why it works well for us is that while the chalice, of course, is associated with the communion ritual, it's also a vessel that's open to more. And there's an open-endedness about Unitarian Universalists. We say that that revelation is not sealed in any particular prophecy or any particular tradition. That if we experience God, God is infinite. And you'll hear people like Shelby Spong talk about that too, and the Dalai Lama. That if you ask the question, what religion is God? Does God have one religion?
Of course he's here.
That's right. And then the flame is important to us because that is the idea of the flame or the lamp is this ongoing search for truth. That's an ancient kind of Greek and Roman kind of idea, but it's been throughout Western history an important symbol for ongoing learning and knowledge. So, yes?
What are your beliefs as far as heaven and hell?
We see those are beliefs that are based on doctrines of the church. Okay, I mean they're referred to in sacred scriptures from not just the Christian tradition. People have different beliefs about heaven and hell. Some people believe that there is something like that. Some people do not. Some people believe that heaven and hell is not a literal place. It's a metaphor for an attitude in life that the heaven and hell, to a certain degree, is right here with us, and not a particular location that you're sent to at a particular time.
So after you die,
that's a big question. We do. People have different ideas about that. As Unitarian Universalists, we do not have like a standard answer to that question. And people genuinely believe different things. Some people believe, well, first of all, we don't know. I mean, some people have experiences that influence how they believe, and they know that. They know what their belief is. But for sure, we don't know. Okay, so it is a question. Some people feel like all we know is that we live and we die, and so what we do with this life is of paramount importance. Some people believe that when we die, because we're made of the same ingredients that are in the universe, that that we're recycled, either physically or more than physically, because with our consciousness, we don't, some people believe that we have a consciousness after death, and that it may take another form or go to another place, but we don't have like a standard answer about that.
What kind of funeral service do you have?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. We call our funerals a celebration of life, or a memorial service. And what is different is we don't have like a sermon that is based on people being saved. What it's focused on the person's life and lifting up their life experience and their relationships to their community and to their families, and it's really a celebration of that person and honoring their wishes if they've made particular wishes, for how they're remembered in terms of their legacy. So it's very individualized.
Okay. I'm interested that you have a chalice. Do you have any kind of a communion service?
We have a couple of communions. Now, earlier on, the Unitarians had communion regularly. And actually, Ralph Waldo Emerson was a Unitarian minister. And one of the reasons he stopped being a Unitarian minister is because we were still doing communion at that time. And, our denomination has changed over time. We gravitated away from the communion ritual with bread and wine. And part of why we did that is because of the doctrines and dogma about the most important thing about Jesus is that he died for our sins and therefore we're saved. So because that's not a core belief for us, the communion ritual does not have the same meaning that it does in other traditions, it's a core ritual. The closest that we come to a ritual, and I started to say this before, is once we had the chalice as a symbol, we light a chalice at the beginning of our services, and we extinguish it at the end. And we often, in meetings, whether they're committee meetings or adult religious education, we often do the same thing as an opening and a closing. But what that does, we say it's a ritual to remind us that we're in a space that's different from the other things that we're involved with in our lives. We're here because this is our faith community. These are the people that we're in covenant with. And we're here to attend to our spiritual development.
But you don't have a communion service where you devour any kind of...
Not bread and wine. Now, at Easter, and that's coming up soon, because what I just said about the communion ritual, that we don't practice a communion on an ongoing basis. Now, sometimes, there's certain times of the year where we may have a communion, like around Thanksgiving or Holy Week, as a part of recognizing those events in the Christian liturgical calendar. But for Easter, because we don't have a core belief in Jesus having to die for our sins, for us to be saved, we recognize that Jesus gave his life because he was committed to the values that he was teaching. He was willing to die for that. And for us, we do not take the resurrection literally. What we say, some people who are Unitarian Universalists may think that Jesus did rise, but as a denomination, we don't teach that. Many people don't. But the way that we take the resurrection is that definitely the spirit and teachings of Jesus did not die when he died. That's obvious. His presence continued to live in the lives of those communities that formed all around him. And so that is a great story of the transforming power of love that we saw in Jesus' life. And that's how we celebrate Easter. Now, what we do at Easter, not everyone again, but many of our congregations have what's called a flower communion. And it's based on a Unitarian minister who was in Prague named Norbert Čapek. He actually had a very large and thriving congregation in Prague during the time of Nazi Germany. He was sent to Dachau, and medical experiments on him, and he died in Dachau. Again, standing up and speaking out for his beliefs in tolerance and compassion. And before his death, he had designed a flower communion that in his congregation they did on the last Sunday of the church year, kind of like we do before we break for summer. And it was a service where all the kids and the adults were together, and people bring flowers, and it's all set up in the front, and then everyone goes up and takes a flower. And the idea of that ritual is that every person, it's the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Every person in that congregation, regardless of their age or their abilities or anything else, is a unique expression, for many people, a unique expression of the divine. So it's a celebration of the humanity of every person, and that's worth protecting. That's worth putting your life on the line. Yes.
So when you, I'm trying to understand this.
Yeah, it's different.
It's alive and they do deeds and they live in love and harmony and all that.
Right.
Do they have a goal for when they leave this earth, like spiritual?
Well, people who are Unitarian Universalists have ideas about this. I'll use another example because the Unitarians, especially around Emerson's time, really were influenced, like I said, they were intellectuals. They were influenced by the Eastern religious traditions early on in America's history, and actually helped to create the first World Parliament of Religions in Chicago, which was in, I believe, 1893, about then. And so the Unitarians invited Vivekananda from India, and people like Emerson before that were reading the Eastern philosophies, and that inspired him to develop the uniquely American philosophy of transcendentalism. And the idea there was, again, reinforcing the individual's experience of the natural world. Now, part of the Eastern influence, we have a lot of people interested in Buddhism within our congregations. And there's a lot of different kinds of Buddhism out there, but there's some really very rich traditions. People like the Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh from Vietnam, who has wonderful teachings. The Dalai Lama, Tibetan Buddhism. Those are both really teachers, but there's a lot of Buddhist traditions. And within the Buddhist tradition, which I don't know if this has come up or not, Buddhism is a really interesting religion because it is a non-theistic religion. So we tend to think of all religions being based on God, but Buddhism is a non-theistic religion because the Buddha was not considered a god or divine. The Buddha was a human being who attained a certain enlightenment while living, and that's the kind of the idea behind it. But in Buddhist thought and in Hindu thought, there is such a thing as reincarnation, of this continuity of lives, and the idea that we could come back and keep having to learn lessons, and that we, live and have more opportunities. So some people believe that. I mean,
so you're saying that as a Unitarian, the individuals, whatever they believe in is...
It's the right of conscience. Yes. The individual has a right of conscience. Yes.
Gotcha.
Yep. Yes.
I think what it is that you can believe in Jesus, you can believe in the Bible, but after the service they have Buddhist meditation. So you could it's okay to do Buddhist meditation in that church, where if you went to a regular Protestant church,
Right.
they wouldn't offer Buddhist meditation.
Right.
So you can do both and still maintain your individual belief. It's not like you're taking anything of teaching one particular religion. What it is, it's opening up like a flower and allowing different people to have their different belief systems and respect that. And it's okay that you have different beliefs, and they don't
Right. Or that you're
people of an ideology like there's not an ideology.
Right.
Is what I'm trying to say.
Right. There's not a common ideology even around the divine.
So this place, this Unitarian
Yes.
building,
Yes.
it's like a multi-religion place where everybody come
Yeah.
and feel at peace with them and whoever, and also be in harmony with
Right.
the human race.
Right. 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 Multi-religious, but also, like I said, unique in that we are welcoming of people who do not claim a religious tradition of their own, for atheists and agnostics, who want to be in community and who care very deeply about other people and are trying to live an ethical life. I mean, as a Unitarian Universalist minister, I use a limited amount of God language, which I mean, specific words about God. I use terms that refer to God that are more open-ended, so that they work for people who are theists and they work for people who are non-theists. So one term that I use often is spirit of life and love.
So my other question is
Yeah.
about the deeds.
Yes.
I heard you say something, you do have people that come in groups, like a community thing where you talk about things.
Right.
Do you choose, I understand that probably most of those people do individual deeds, but do you generally try to put a group together to do some deeds at large in
Right.
the community? Or?
Social activism and social justice type things? Well, of course, we're involved in a lot of the same things that your churches are involved with in the local community. I mean, it's Pensacola, but we're involved with Manna Food Bank. We're involved with a couple of things that maybe not all of your churches. We've been involved with Habitat for Humanity before and those kinds of things. We are involved with Books for Prisoners. And one of the things that we've gotten involved with in the last couple of years that has really gotten a lot of people excited is the Bridges Out of Poverty Circles program. And I think they are starting to have that over here too, which is a really wonderful program. And it kind of falls under the umbrella of Catholic Charities, but it's ecumenical and even interfaith. But it's a really great organization. So we're involved in, and we do stuff for the Gulf Coast Kids House for foster kids, and, so we do a lot of those kinds of things. Now, some things that we do that are different from other traditions is... well, we were very active in the civil rights movement, and there was a Unitarian minister who was actually killed, and it mobilized the Unitarian clergy to march with Dr. King. So that was an important time for us. But because of we are welcoming and affirming of gay, lesbian, bisexual and transgender people. Now, a lot of other denominations are still kind of working that out. Well, we've been opening for a while, or we've been welcoming for a while. We even have clergy who are openly gay and lesbian. We've been performing ceremonies of union for many years. Because of that, and our denomination has taken an official stand on that. So, unlike some other things, as a minister, I can speak out for inclusion and equality on this issue and represent my denomination. Now, there are other issues for which we don't have like a party line about. So I can have my own opinion, and I can say, this is my opinion, and I happen to be a Unitarian Universalist minister. But because we're welcoming, we have been very active on the issue of marriage equality, for example.
Yeah, I understand. Glad you was pretty open about that. I feel the same way simply because God made all humans, and there's no reason that, and it always takes me back to where the black people had to sit behind the church and everybody sat in the front, and yet
Right.
It just beyond me of how people could have thought they were so holy.
Yeah, making other people less than human.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you said you're a minister. Do
Yeah.
you have, does your denomination or whatever?
Yes.
you wanna-
Right.
Your
Right. Religious movement.
seminary.
Yes, I went to a Unitarian Universalist seminary. We had 3. Harvard is one of the oldest, and it was a Unitarian seminary. Now it's a non-denominational seminary. We have 2 other seminaries, one in Chicago, Meadville Lombard, and actually I'm working on a doctorate of ministry now, and I took classes in Chicago, and now I've transferred into a UCC church, a United Church of Christ Congregationalist in Minneapolis, because my school moved and they're redoing their doctoral program. That's why I'm doing that. But I got my Master's of Divinity degree at Starr King School for the Ministry, and that's in Berkeley, and it's a part of the Graduate Theological Union out there. Yeah, but Unitarian Universalists also go to other schools for seminary training. And then we have a credentialing body, that we go before. And the way that we have to get a degree, and then we have the credentialing body that grants us fellowship, what it's called. Oh, and I wanted to talk about that. And then, but in our tradition, only the congregation has the authority to ordain ministers. And because we have Congregationalist polity, our congregations can ordain anyone they want to be a minister. They don't have to have a Master's of Divinity degree or be in fellowship. Now, we do encourage congregations to ordain people who have gone through the process, and that when we call ministers, we encourage congregations to call people who have been trained in our tradition, but they don't have to.
How do you call a person?
It's a mutual selection process, yes, and it's by democratic
power to boot you out if they don't like you.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. We're not placed. It's a mutual decision between the minister and the congregation. Did you have another?
Well, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but would you classify your religion as non-denominational or no?
No, it's not non-denominational because we are Unitarian Universalism. I mean, it is a denomination. Because that's how we affiliate. Non-denominational, what I understand of that term, means Christian but not affiliated with any particular sub-tradition of Christianity or denomination. But we definitely have a denominational affiliation as Unitarian Universalists. I want to come back to the fellowship thing, but...
Do you get a salary?
Do I get a salary?
No, does whoever's in charge get a salary?
Well, I'm a minister, and I get a salary. We have what's called a minister's compensation package. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But all of the money our annual budget is created solely by contributions of the members and friends who are active in that congregation. We don't receive money from any external sources in the denomination. We can use our resources just like anyone else. We can rent our building or generate income, have a daycare facility or something like that. But we're self-supporting. Yeah. I wanted to come back to the fellowship because what's interesting about our individual congregations is that depending on where they are, we have kind of a variety of names. Now, we have Universalist church that were Universalists before we merged in 1961, and we had Unitarian churches, lots of them in the Northeast around Boston, which is where our headquarters are, that were obviously around 1700s and 1800s. when the denominations merged or consolidated, it was up to every individual congregation whether or not they wanted to change the name of the church. Most of them did, not all of them. Some of them kept their original name from before. I mean, especially if they have a historic building and everything, that's an important identity for them. We have a Universalist church in Mississippi. It's by Laurel. I can't remember that. There's two little towns over there. Anyway, since the 1800s, and they didn't want to change their name, and that's a big part of their identity. Sometimes you'll see Universalist first and then Unitarian, which would show that they were a Universalist church before, Most of them went to Unitarian Universalist. For a while we were hyphenating it, then we took it out. Now, not all of our congregations are called churches. Many are called fellowships. And we had actually what was called a fellowship movement. And it was kind of a growth plan. And it happened in the 50s, in the 60s. And there was one guy in particular, I mean, he didn't come up with it all by himself, and he didn't do it single-handedly, but he was kind of a circuit rider, and he went around to a lot of smaller towns with universities, and he started what were called fellowships. He was he appealed to a lot of people, professional people and academics who had grown disenchanted with what they called the supernatural language of Christianity, and wanted to have a more rational approach to religion. So they started a lot of fellowships with the idea that they would be lay-led, that they would not have clergy. Of course, that also coincided with a lot of questioning of authority. Religious authority, any kind of authority. And so we had fellowships seated all around the country, starting from in the 50s, and both of our congregations started that way, as a part of the fellowship movement, and went many years without religious or ministerial leadership. Now, some of them, like the congregation that I serve, changed their name from fellowship to church. And we did that about 15 years ago when we moved from a house that was kind of in downtown Pensacola into a building that we bought on the north side that actually had been a funeral home before. But it works great as a church. It has a nice big sanctuary and then classrooms along the side. But the reason that this group decided, that was before I got there, to change our name to a church was to, besides moving into a new facility, was to raise our visibility as a faith community in a very Christian, larger area, to be accepted as a legitimate faith community, even though the word church doesn't fit a lot of people. I mean, we have Jewish people who come and are Unitarian Universalists, so especially for them, the name church, doesn't work. And atheists and agnostics don't like the word church either, because that's a Christian term. And not everyone who comes identifies themselves as a Christian. So, the congregation where I became a Unitarian Universalist was in Durham, North Carolina, and near what's called the Research Triangle Park. I lived in Chapel Hill, and the church was in Durham, and Raleigh is close by, and the church was right off Interstate 40. And while I was there, I started going there in 1991, and I left in 1998 to go to seminary. And while I was there, the church grew from about 350 to 800. And it was called a fellowship, and it had started as a fellowship and never changed its name. So we do have both. Yes?
Does the religion try to help support other congregations or parishes that might just be starting out or that are having financial trouble? Is there a way?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned that our headquarters are in Boston. That's like the main offices of the Unitarian Universalist Association. We have what are called field staff, including a president of the denomination. And out of Boston, they generate a lot of resource materials for us, religious education curricula and things like that. But they also have field staff that go out and help congregations with various issues, whether it's growth or personnel issues or that kind of thing. And we have a thing called a Chalice Lighters Fund that individuals in congregations contribute to, and then they make grants, congregations apply for them, for specific purposes, and they're given by a committee based on need and that kind of thing. So we do help each other out, and it's part of being in a covenanted tradition is that, this says we the member congregations. This isn't just one congregation, so we're in a covenanted relationship with her congregation. And for example, her pastor Rod Debs and I, we meet with the Unitarian Universalist ministers of Alabama in Montgomery every month. There's about 7 of us that meet regularly, and the idea is, to provide both collegial support but also congregational support. We don't do it, as much as we could. Especially in the South, our congregations are spread out from each other. In the Northeast, there's a lot more, yeah. And in some other parts of the country, they grew faster than in the South. But yes.
Is the foundation of the Unitarian Universalist Church, was that in Europe centuries ago?
Well, we were a part of the people who fled Europe for religious freedom, as of the Protestant Reformation that I said before. We did have a very active tradition in Eastern Europe. Transylvania actually had a king at one time that was the first to issue an edict of religious tolerance. Although a lot of people don't realize, Islam and Christianity have both been imperialistic, and there have been other empires that had a religious element as well. But really, in Islamic empires, they were often more tolerant of religious differences than the Christians have been. Now that is not true altogether over time, but there was a long period of time where that was true. And in Transylvania, the king, who happened to be a Unitarian, had the first edict of religious tolerance, which was then taken back by the next king who got into power. So it didn't last very long.
What was the name of that organization? Any one of them. That one is when you speak of.
The one in Transylvania?
Sure.
Which is called the Unitarian Church, and it's still there in Romania.
The name Unitarian is... Okay.
Yes,
right.
Yes, and it emerged, even though it emerged when during the Protestant Reformation with the Puritans and the Pilgrims that came to the colonies, but at the same time, in Eastern Europe, there was a similar thing happening that was based on the same idea of you can recognize Jesus and the religion of Christianity without agreeing to the doctrine of the Trinity, that Jesus was co-equal with God from the beginning of time.
Are there 2 or 3 names that
individuals
that are significant in the early stages of this movement?
Yes, Michael Servetus is one. Francis David. I'll write them. If you like history stuff, Michael Servetus. I don't know if that's an E or a U. I think. And Francis David. And they were, prominent figures like Calvin and Luther, in their times.
So, approximately when did they live? Wikipedia.
Yes, you can look them up. I am thinking, this is bad. If Rod Debs were here, he would know this. I'm not good with that. I'm thinking 1700s, early 1800s.
Actually, out of time for those who need to go to another classroom, or you are excused. But
Well,
thank you.
Thank you for